what Alethea and I thought we'd do today is use the Ware Creek School as kind of a case study to discuss the strategies that we found were useful or were successful in getting a completed Rosenwald school. We went through the whole restoration process. So this talk is really for those of you who are either considering doing a restoration project or undertaking a rehabilitation project of a Rosenwald school, or for those of you who are just getting under the way. So hopefully this will be kind of a helpful hints program for you. Some of what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll turn the program over to Alethea, may sound like common sense, but you'll really be amazed at the number of historic preservation projects that never go to fruition just because they get off on the wrong foot. So having, kind of some good strategies to get going on the right foot can really help get things underway. So the first strategy that we have is obviously you need dynamic leadership, and this is really critical. Any historic preservation project requires energetic leadership to keep things moving, and the person or persons who have to act as organizer, cheerleader, fundraiser, grant writer, as well as functioning in an array of other less than glamorous tasks. They have to be quite an energetic person. And Alethea Williams-King, who will be speaking after I am finished, she really embodies the leadership qualities that were necessary to keep a project like the Rosenwald restoration at Ware Creek going on. And I've certainly enjoyed working with Alethea over the years. She's kind of my partner in crime on this project. So we've had a lot of fun in doing the Ware Creek project. Although the original intent of the Ware Creek School Rosenwald project was not one of preservation for preservation's sake, Alethea and her organization realized the significance and importance of the Ware Creek School. And as a result, the preservation aspect of the project was wholeheartedly embraced by her organization, the Ware Creek Community Development Program, as one of its primary goals. And in 1998, there was a newspaper article that came out with a quote from Alethea that said that we're not a restoration society with the sole focus of getting the building restored. We're a community improvement association. We just happen to be blessed with an historic treasure. And that single quote really set the tone, the philosophy, and the direction for the Ware Creek project, and really was an inspiration to all the people that were involved. So leadership skills such as diplomacy, tenacity, and organization are obvious traits that a leader needs. But a leader also has to possess the passion and drive and appreciation of the importance of what their building is, both from a physical standpoint and from a cultural standpoint. And that person really needs to have a clear vision of how to attain the desired goal of a restored or preserved Rosenwald school, as well as incorporating whatever programmatically they want to put in that building. One important piece of advice that I'd like to share concerning the organization of the group, of your leadership especially, is to keep the building or the board very small. Oftentimes that we see design or project managed by a large group just tends to bog things down. The old cliche that too many cooks in the kitchen is really true in this instance. So it's advisable that if you do have a big board, to form a small advisory committee, whether it's a design committee or a restoration committee, to interface with the day-to-day restoration work and report back to the larger board. That's just going to make things go a whole lot easier. The second strategy I'd like to talk about is defining the end product. So in order to select the appropriate treatment for your historic school building, you have to have an idea of what the desired final product would be. So the treatment of a building that's going to be used as a community center or a medical clinic is going to require much different treatment than a building that will be restored as a museum. And this leads me to a discussion of what's known as the Secretary of Interior Standards and Guidelines. These are available on the National Park Service's website, which is www.nps.gov, and I'll have a slide that has their website. The Secretary of the Interior is responsible for establishing standards for all national preservation projects and programs, for advising federal agencies on the preservation of historic properties that are listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. So in looking at any proposed project that will have an effect on the National Register listed or eligible property, our agency, the North Carolina State Preservation Office, as well as most other state preservation offices, use the Secretary of Interior's standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. And those guidelines discuss 4 preservation treatments for buildings. One is preservation, one is rehabilitation, one is restoration, and one is reconstruction. So before you actually begin any physical work to your school building, you have to select one of those 4 treatments in order to get off on the right foot. And the treatment that you select is going to be based on what your proposed use of that building is going to be. So in the majority of cases in dealing with the preservation of Rosenwald schools, you're either going to select rehabilitation or restoration. Either one of those standards is what you're would be most applicable to the Rosenwald schools. So the rehabilitation standards would apply if the building was being adaptively reused, either as a community center, as a clinic, as some type of school or other type of modern use. The rehabilitation standards address the most prevalent preservation treatment today, which is known as rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is defined as the process of returning a property to a state of utility through repair or alteration, which makes possible an efficient contemporary use while preserving those portions and features of the property which are significant to its historic, architectural, and cultural values. And those are 2 really key things that are important. One, you can put a new use in any historic building, and if you do it in such a way that preserves the historic character and the historic integrity, it's a win-win both for preservation and for what your organization wants to do programmatically. Now, the restoration standards, on the other hand, would be used in a situation where you might want to restore your Rosenwald School for use as a museum. And restoration as a treatment is defined as the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and characters of a property as it appeared at a particular time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and the reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. So once a preservation treatment has been selected, you can move to the next step, and the next strategy would be the development of a restoration or rehabilitation plan. And this is really where you start the actual kind of hardcore planning of what you're going to do. So like I said, in order to develop this plan, you have to determine what the future use of that building is going to be. Now, I strongly recommend that when you prepare a plan, that page 1 of that plan either include the restoration or the rehabilitation standards as page 1. And if you look at these online, they're really just 10 short sentences. They're almost common sense when you look at them, but they have been so distilled down that they essentially will guide all future work, and they apply to all building types, buildings of all materials, so they're applicable to any type of preservation work that you might want to do. Now, prior to undertaking any restoration or rehabilitation work on a building, a thorough study and assessment of a building's condition should be done. And essentially, you need to know what you have from a stylistic standpoint, from a historic standpoint, and from a condition standpoint. So what is this animal of the Rosenwald School or whatever type of building that you happen to be dealing with? And as part of this process, the existing condition should be documented with overall and close-up photographs. And you want to take a lot of photographs, which of course are easy to do in this day and age with digital photography, because those photographs are going to provide a baseline of documentation that future work can be evaluated with. And it's always fun to show people this is what it looked like before and this is what it looks like after. So it's kind of neat to see the evolution of that project. Now, all properties are going to change over time, and in some cases, those past alterations are going to take on historic significance in their own right. So what you need to do in undertaking this evaluation is look for clues as to how your building changed over time and determine if these later changes have gained historic significance in their own right and should be retained. You also want to assess what features are in need of restoration or repair and how to best undertake those repair to accurately restore or repair them. And this kind of pre-plan assessment is mostly done by conducting a thorough visual inspection of the building. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. One other very important preparatory task that should be undertaken prior to the development of a restoration or rehabilitation plan is to assemble any historic information, historic evidence that might help guide any future work on the building. So for Rosenwald schools, this would include things like the collection of historic photographs of your building, plans of the building, an examination of primary source documents such as County Board of Education records or the Rosenwald Fund records, which are housed at Fisk University. The other thing that's critical, if you still have alumni who attended the school that are still living, the interviews with alumni can also provide vital historic background information that can help you guide the work that you're doing. Now, the collection of the historic background information for Ware Creek School was extremely beneficial to us in undertaking the project for several reasons. First of all, it was very useful in helping us to develop that rehabilitation plan. We got to see pictures of before and after, so we knew what it looked like pretty much after the day it was built. Secondly, that historic background information created a body of information that was utilized by a paid consultant that was hired to prepare the National Register of Historic Places nomination. So a lot of the legwork of having that background history, if you have that done, that's going to save you money in actually having a National Register nomination prepared. Third, what we did with that information at Ware Creek was we found it was quite useful in the development of museum exhibits and promotional materials, both about the school building itself and about what the Ware Creek Community Development Program was actually doing. So it was a great PR tool that when people see these great historic photographs or photographs of the classroom, it's a very evocative thing to have. Fourth, that historic information was incorporated into applications for grant monies that were done throughout the course of the project. And I would say lastly, and probably the most important thing, is all of that information, especially the oral interviews that were done, preserve the stories and the history of the people that attended Ware Creek. So we have a great building, and that built landscape shows us what happened, but that would just be a vestige if we didn't have the stories that went with it. So the collection of that history is very important. I mentioned the County Board of Education records, and this may vary state to state, but here in North Carolina is that these, as a research tool, are incredible. They're a great source of information. The Board of Education in many counties took photographs of the exterior of their school buildings between the 1930s and 1940s. And I recommend that you contact the local Board of Education to see if they might have those photographs or might have turned them over to a local historical society or the local library. And in some instances, those records contain copies of the old insurance policies that the school board had on their school buildings, or at least summaries of those surveys. And the image you see here on the left side of the screen is actually the insurance summary for the Ware Creek School. It talks about when it was built and what they were insuring it for. So it was really kind of a neat document to have. And believe it or not, this was just shoved in some file cabinet in the Board of Education offices. And when we asked, they pulled out this whole thing, and it was every school in Beaufort County, which was just not only valuable for Ware Creek, but from the State Preservation Office, a wonderful research tool for countywide surveys, because it documented every school white and black in the whole county. The insurance policies also, if you're lucky, will have a floor plan or at least a ground plan of those buildings, or a site plan. The one that we found for Pitt County actually had a site plan for every building on each school campus throughout the county, which was great because it showed where the outhouses were, it showed where the playgrounds were, so it was a really neat tool to have. So once you understand the history of your building and an idea of how that building evolved over time and what the existing building conditions are, you can now proceed to develop that restoration or rehabilitation plan. So the plan should summarize the existing conditions. It should include recommendations and ideally specifications for the work to be done to the building. And it should be divided into logical areas of work, such as structural repairs or the treatment of historic interior spaces, mechanical systems, plumbing systems, that type of stuff. Now, it's usually at this point in the discussion that people's heads start spinning and say that I don't know anything about restoration or making a plan, or do I need an architect, and how do I deal with historic plaster, and it kind of blows their mind. What I'll say, for most of these early 20th century school buildings. They're very simple utilitarian buildings. So for the most part, you're not going to require the services of an architect. However, if you're dealing with a large-scale project that might have either require drawings or you have code issues, if you're changing the use, an architect might be a worthwhile investment. Obviously, what you're going to do is you need to hire competent craftspeople and contractors to actually do the work. Preferably, those folks should have experience in dealing with historic buildings and building fabric. In addition to having those competent people on board who can somewhat help guide you through this, I want to discuss two avenues of technical assistance and recommend that you take advantage of both of those in the rehabilitation or restoration of your building, which is strategy for the utilization of free technical restoration assistance. And the first avenue of technical restoration assistance would be forming a partnership with your state's Historic Preservation Office. The way that the federal legislation is, the 1966 Preservation Act required that all states have a state historic preservation office, so every of the 50 states have one of these. I'm going to discuss other types of partnerships later in my talk, but I want to concentrate on a partnership with the State Preservation Office, or what's known as the SHPO here. In North Carolina, one of the services that our restoration branch within our State Preservation Office has is providing restoration technical assistance to property owners and local governments and private citizens who own historic buildings. And all owners of historic buildings in North Carolina have access to this service. It's free of charge. Other states may operate slightly differently, but most of your state historic preservation offices can provide some level of technical assistance. Now, our restoration branch has actually 6 restoration specialists, so each restoration specialist is assigned a different region of the state, so you could look by county on our website to find out who your man, if you're from North Carolina, or lady is. We have Jennifer Cathy in our eastern office is our restoration specialist for the west. So in North Carolina, our technical consultation incurs no cost or obligation, so it's your tax dollars at work. A building does not have to be listed in the National Register or have any other special designation to be eligible for this service. And consultations that we offer are done on a time available basis and include both telephone consultations and site visits where we come out and do on-site inspections of the building and work with you or contractors or whoever. And although often our staff cannot prepare in-depth plans or specifications for restoration projects, we can provide sample specifications and help you tailor those specifications to your building specific. And we can also provide printed technical information materials for the cost of reproduction, as well as make recommendations for other good sources of information that might be useful to you. The National Trust is another great group to partner with. They're an excellent source of technical information. Their website for the Rosenwald School Initiative, which is shown here, as well as their folks in the Charleston Field office, are both excellent sources for technical assistance, and they're happy to talk to you about your Rosenwald School project. The second avenue of free technical assistance that I want to discuss is the large amount of good restoration or rehabilitation guidance that's available on the internet. And I want to call your attention to 2 publication series that are extremely useful to folks who are undertaking preservation projects. And these are the Preservation Briefs and the Preservation Tech Notes, which are published by the National Park Service's Technical Preservation Services Division. Now, the Technical Services Division of NPS produces a wide variety of educational materials on preserving, rehabilitating, and restoring historic buildings. And that information is all going to be based on the Secretary's standards and guidelines that I mentioned before. And these include not only the preservation briefs and the tech notes, but they have other in-depth source books and case studies, videos, and web pages on the internet they're extremely useful. So they're a good source. So if you go to nps.gov with a / of TPS for the preservation services, a lot of information is on there. Now, the preservation briefs and the tech notes are a series that provide practical, easy-to-read guidance and information on traditional practices and innovative techniques for successfully maintaining, preserving, and restoring historic buildings. So even if you're not planning to physically undertake the work yourself, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with these publications. They're very beneficial if you have to talk to contractors or craftspeople. That way you're using the same language, or you can wave these in the people's face and say, do what they say in here. The preservation briefs and tech notes contain a lot of textual information and are illustrated mostly with black and white images. They cover all aspects of historic building fabric, such as windows, doors, different finishes, masonry, mechanical systems, structural repair. Everything that you need to do to a historic building is probably covered by one of these preservation brief or tech notes. They also include a lot of information on things like handicap accessibility, the placement of museum collections in historic buildings. So it's a great go-to resource of real concise, good information for people who are not preservation professionals. And currently there are about 46 preservation briefs and I think about 45 tech notes that are available. And all of these can be accessed online at the Park Service website. You can also order them in hard copy from the U.S. Government Printing Office for those of you who like to feel the paper if your printer doesn't work. One last free publication I want to mention is Mary Hofschell's Preserving Rosenwald Schools. If y'all haven't seen this, it's published by the National Trust. It's also chock full of good information, and this is available. You can download and print that out on the Trust website. There are also numerous books on specific treatments for repair and restoration of historic buildings that have been published. Magazines like Old House Journal provide good articles on restoration methods. These publications can be a great resource for valuable information. And while they're not free, a lot of libraries will have these books available to you, so you can sign them out from the library. The fifth strategy is the utilization of partnerships and outside resources. You'll hear consistently that partnerships are the way to get things done. And this is so true. It certainly worked well for us at Ware Creek. Now, one of the things that made the Ware Creek School rehabilitation so successful was the partnership with outside groups and institutions. And I've already discussed the partnership that Ware Creek had with the State Preservation Office. A second benefit of the partnership with the State Preservation Office was that they had access to college interns that we had that would come to the Preservation Office. And we basically assigned those interns to work on various aspects of the Ware Creek project. And this led to a partnership both with the History and Recreation and Leisure Studies Department at East Carolina University. And beginning in 1996, ECU student interns that were working under the auspices of our office based in Greenville began working on various aspects of the Ware Creek project. And these interns received academic credit for the work they were doing, while the Ware Creek Community Development Program benefited from the fruits of their labor at no cost to them. So they had free labor under the guidance of preservation professionals that were working with them on this project. And the projects that were undertaken by these students capitalized on each of the students' areas of interest. And in many cases, the students had taken ideas that were generated by the Ware Creek Community Development Association and put those into professional formats that were used for grant providers, for publicity, and even things that contractors utilized. One example was in 1996, in October of that year, ECU intern Zara Anashanslan completed the Historic Structures Report for the Ware Creek School under the guidance of Preservation Office staff members. And this report summarized the background history of Ware Creek School. It included measured drawings that were prepared both by the students and one of our staff members who was an architect. It had verbal and photographic documentation of the interior and exterior conditions of that building and recommendations for the repair and preservation of the building's historic fabric, all in accordance with the Secretary standards that I mentioned before. So the HSR report that Zara had completed essentially acted as Ware Creek's restoration plan or rehabilitation plan and was used to guide the work for contractors. So we made this available to all the contractors who were working. Another ECU internship project was undertaken by Janice Miller, who was majoring in museum studies. And Janice inventoried all the historic artifacts that Ware Creek had. She created an exhibit outlining the history of the Rosenwald School's building program and actually set up a recreation of a furnished classroom with desks and the chalkboards which were already there. So it was really a neat thing. We had some landscape architecture students, James Mendenhall and Mason Dyer, help to plan a functional landscape for the Ware Creek School, and this was all based on the historic layout of the grounds. And that's just a sample of some of the great things that have been accomplished through the partnership with ECU using interns. Now, other rehabilitation projects that I've been involved with have received free hands-on assistance with the less technical, kind of physical labor aspects of their projects. And this physical restoration work was done through partnerships that included construction management programs at community college, and we have Monica Fleming in the audience here who's with Edgecombe Community College, and they have a preservation trades program. We've worked with different college-level preservation classes, Department of Corrections work release programs. We've had projects involving Boy and Girl Scout troops, as well as 4-H clubs and other civic organizations like the Kiwanis Club, Habitat for Humanity, and local National Guard troops. So in using this type of labor, the one caution is that you have to be sure that the people doing that free labor do the work or are supervised by persons who are knowledgeable in the repair and preservation of historic buildings. And you see that little boy on the upper right, he's about 7 or 8 years old, was extremely passionate about wanting to be messing with historic buildings. So we're training the future group of preservation professionals right there, actually doing physical hands-on work. The sixth strategy is the utilization of skilled contractors and craftspeople when needed. So for more technical restoration work items that you need, you'll want to utilize contractors and craftspeople who are sensitive to historic building fabric. Most, like I said, state preservation offices, in part of what they do is with technical assistance, they maintain a list of craftspeople and consultants or contractors who have a history and a track record of successful rehabilitation projects, and they can share those names with you. Again, a lot of those projects that you work on, if you get contractors who have done it before, they're familiar with not only how to deal with historic fabric, but deal with the Secretary's standards, so they know how to do it right. Another interesting source of skilled craftspeople are actually retired school district building maintenance personnel. And on occasion, we've used these folks to come out and work on historic school buildings. They know them like the back of their hand. And a lot of times they enjoy working on these short-term, small-scale projects. And the beauty of some of these guys, they're masterful at keeping things like radiant heat boilers working because they worked on them for years and years, and they kind of just really get into these projects. As I mentioned before, if you or your contractor are in doubt as to the proper preservation method in undertaking your work, call your state preservation office for technical assistance, and they can talk to you or talk to your contractor. Now, the seventh and final strategy I want to discuss is the use of logical and efficient work sequences. In an ideal world, we'd all have big pots of money, and we'd be able to complete a rehabilitation project as a single-phase project, but in reality, that seldom happens. Most of these projects stretch over several years. The work at Ware Creek actually, I think, had to be completed in small phases that we undertook probably between 1993 and 2005 is when the majority of that work was actually done. So it took us a long time to get from the start to something that was a usable end product. And I want to mention 3 points regarding this strategy. First is that if finances are an issue, you want to develop logical work phases and basically break that project up into manageable chunks. It may be necessary to what we call mothball a building in between different work phases, but ideally those work phases should be spelled out in your rehabilitation plan. Second, you'll want to undertake work items that are most critical to the preservation of the building first, such as making sure your roof is weather tight or your windows are boarded up, that type of stuff. So in planning various phases, be mindful that any work that you do, the future work should not damage work that's already completed. So you don't want to polish your floors before you repair your plaster. And that's why it's good to have a plan. So if somebody comes to you and say, we need to do this, you can point to the plan and say, well, no, it says we need to be doing this. Lastly, you want to plan your work phases to coincide with funding streams or material donations. When planning for the repair of things like historic windows, funding gimmicks such as having individual people or families sponsor the repair of a single window really work great. So for a small monetary investment, people can say, my money restore that particular window or that particular door. For nonprofit organizations, at the appropriate time or phase in your project, you may be able to approach your local home improvement store like Lowe's or Home Depot for the donations of paint or building materials, and you want to time that to be able to ask for those donations for when you can actually use them. So in closing, I just want to say that these 7 strategies have worked for us in restoring the Ware Creek School. Alethea is going to talk to you about some of the other things from the organizational standpoint, but while all of this strategy was going on, Alethea was doing things like grant writing and fundraising and all that. So there are a lot of things going on, but for just starting out, I think those strategies will really help you get a successful project.